So the Nintendo Switch has been in the news a lot for the hacking scene that seems to have cracked it early on, and it seems that Nintendo is kind of firing back with the new 5.0 update that seemed to have a lot more going on behind the scenes than what was apparent to the consumer and the gamers. Now, one thing a lot of people noticed pretty early on was that there was some other chip being referenced in the firmware. Now, it wasn't obvious as to what that chip was because at the time they were still digging through the code. By they, I mean people who data mine, go through, people who search and research vulnerabilities were going through it. And we kind of knew at the time that the T214 at least existed in the firmware, at least referencing to a new chipset. And that's from the T210 that is technically in reference to the Tegra X1 that we all know about now that is in the Nintendo Switch. It seemed like Nintendo and Nvidia were working together to fix the one issue that seems flawed with the Switch, and that has to do with stuff in the background where the X1 technically has an exploit that everyone seemed to figure out, right? Well, it seems that data miners have found a few other things that may suggest not only an entire Switch revision, but maybe a more powerful Switch coming up. Now we're going to go through, in this case, some tweets from Mike Heskin, and he is a vulnerability researcher and data miner. He's looking through the Switch firmware right now, 5.0, and has made quite a few findings that we're going to take a look at now, starting with this tweet here. Found very strong evidence of a whole new PCB and 8 gigabytes of memory for new T214 Switch, codenamed Mariko. Down from there, he furthered his claims with, in this case, more evidence saying, oh right, I should have clarified this better. The strongest evidence for a new PCB is the added support for a new PMIC and PCV sys module. MAX 77621 will be replaced by MAX 77812. PMIC stands for Power Management Integrated Circuit. And after that, Mike also clarifies an interesting fact, saying Tegra systems are codenamed after Marvel characters. TK1 was Logan, of course Wolverine. TX1 was Arista, who is Logan's son, or Wolverine's son in this case. And now T214 SoC name Mariko comes from Mariko Yashida, who is Wolverine's lover. Whether this symbolizes Nvidia and Nintendo's scorching romance remains to be seen. So here we are now with what what people generally expect based on Nintendo's history to be doing. Now, is this the case? It's hard to say, and I'm going to kind of explain why. It's very, very weird to see a reference to more RAM in the retail version of the Switch. This is something you would see in the developer's kit firmware, something we already know about. We already know the developer's kit have 8 gigabytes of RAM and a 64 gigabyte onboard storage. That's something we've known about for a long time. It was referenced a while ago from a developer who kind of put out their screenshot image and we could see it, that's what they were working with. So it makes sense. Developer kits generally need more RAM because they debug while they're running their game or program to see, and they need the extra RAM to do that. That is pretty common. In this case though, the only reason we would be finding this is if, yeah, there is some sort of revision coming down the line, and maybe they're opening up that possibility now in the firmware. We've seen stuff show up way before it's used in firmware in other systems before, so this technically isn't anything new. Like, I don't think a revision is like coming this year, is what I'm saying. Maybe 2019. Nintendo is known to show up with a revision sometimes within 2 years of the launch of their system. It happened with the DS and the DS Lite, happened with the Game Boy and the Game Boy SP. It's not uncommon, is what I will say. Now, the idea of the T214, most of us thought generally was for security, to patch security through a hardware method. Now we're finding out, and other data miners like Pluto are pretty much in agreement here. Yes, it looks like a new PCB is being used, a new chipset, and more RAM is being referenced. Now, the one thing I'm a little confused about, I don't really know how extra RAM would help massively. Listen, more RAM will help. More RAM always helps, but would it be a massive, like, black and white difference, something you could absolutely notice, right? No gray areas or anything? Probably not. And the big reason there is the bandwidth would probably still be the same. They would have to increase the 25 gigabytes per second bandwidth that the X1 has. Now, we're finding out that this chip is going to be customized to eliminate the X1, the exploit that everyone's using for the X1, the hardware exploit, and it's being at least designed to patch that out. Now, could they be patching something in through a hardware level to increase the bandwidth? Because that would make it so that things like dynamic resolution wouldn't drop as much. The big reason you see that is generally because the bandwidth, the 25 gigabytes per second, is pretty low. They're using compression and stuff to make it at least work, and that's why some ports from last generation come over to the Switch and have, in some cases, higher resolution, right? We've seen that. But it's weird that they would add more RAM without making, in this case, the floodgates larger and add a better way to get information back and forth from RAM, CPU, and GPU by increasing that bandwidth. That's something that NVIDIA and I'm sure Nintendo could work together to do. And that revision probably wouldn't be anytime soon. It's hard to believe Nintendo would show up now with that, or soon even. I mean, it's in the OS now, the reference to it. And I can't imagine it's a dev kit only because why would it be in the retail version? Why would data miners find it in the retail version? I do think a revision is coming at some point. Maybe a year and a half from now. We all know Nintendo wants to do the new Switch or whatever, right? It's commonplace. They've talked about peripherals to the Wall Street Journal, at least for this year, and that makes sense. I don't think we'll see a revision this year, but sometime in the future? Yeah, definitely. I think in this case, Mike also pointed out that they named it after a Marvel character to kind of talk a bit about how like they have redesigned this chip as its own entity, right? Even Pluto said it was kind of a fork. Like it's not like the X1 completely. It seems to be its own chipset, and they have now given it a code name as well. That tells me that there's probably more to it than just a security flaw patch. I just don't think they would go that far to rename it, much like they did with the TK1 to the TX1, to rename it to a whole new chip like that with a code name and everything. It sounds like something they've probably been working on for a little while. It's very possible. I'm not going to say absolutely. It's very possible that this could in some way incorporate Pascal from the X2 into a mobile, really a more mobile, more battery-friendly model. It's hard to say if that's the case, but man, it's very interesting to see 8 gigabytes of RAM be referenced and a brand new chipset. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think about this whole situation with the X1 and the potential T214, what we have now codenamed as Mariko. Let me know what you think about all of this, because it's very, very interesting to have this start to pop up, and we are already talking about doubling the RAM in the Switch, right? Adding maybe more bandwidth, adding security. Let me know, guys, what you think about this. Would you be all in and buying a new Switch revision? I think I would. I think I'd buy a Switch revision pretty much right away, especially if they promised, in this case, a better dynamic resolution. I mean, think about it. These games are set up with a dynamic resolution, something that really changes and adapts well to more powerful hardware. So if they have their roof resolution set at 1080p or 900p, and we see it drop down to like 600p at times when you're playing, it would not drop that low all the time or at all. We saw it with the Xbox One X, right? That came out, Halo 5 has a dynamic resolution, even if you're playing on a 1080p TV, right? With the Xbox One, the Xbox One S, that resolution would drop to keep that frame rate. But when the X comes around, the resolution barely drops at all, if at all, and the frame rate stays steady. That is what's great and forward thinking about dynamic resolution. Games will look better and work better as better hardware becomes available. And that's where it's going to get interesting. Nintendo wants a family of systems that run off of the same operating system as they've talked about, and even kind of pointed to Android and iOS as being the example. So maybe they really do just want a family of systems that we can all pick from. Maybe you're a power user, you don't mind spending the extra $200 for a really powerful system, Switch or whatnot, but maybe the other person doesn't care and they're like, I'll take the $300 Switch, that's fine with me. That's, I think, a world that Nintendo wants to get to. It's just the journey could be kind of rocky, could be bumpy, it's hard to say. But very intriguing nonetheless. We'll see if any other information comes out or if Nintendo decides to announce anything. I have a feeling they won't right away, and maybe this is just a quiet update without that 8 gigabytes of RAM, and then they'll kind of work towards adding that to a future revision. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.